just a little bit about service bots. So as Richard said, previous company was in the mobile space, mobile platform. We see conversation as the next evolution of what's happening. If you look at, mobile apps were big sort of 5, 6 years ago, then chat apps began to take over and people are moving towards conversation being a mainstream interface. And that's what sort of this big trend really is all about. So let me start. We're going to talk about this. First of all, just to look back at, if you look at some of the participants asked questions about, I hit using these chatbots, why are they being used? Well, actually, if you look at what happened over the last 12 months, that was a huge driver in terms of the adoption of conversational AI. We saw a massive increase in the use. I know IBM Watson have a query about their numbers being up hugely. Gartner talk about increases in using it. And the answer is utility. I mean, people will really only use chatbots if they provide a utility, if they solve a problem for them, right? Some of us get a little frustrated maybe at that annoying chatbot that's always popping up when you don't want it, but that's just like, we call it the online equivalent of the shopping assistant, right? Who's always popping up and saying, can I help you now? And you really just want to browse. So I think there are good ways to do that, but really chatbots adoption is because they solve a problem and that they, are engaged. During the pandemic, when it hit, we saw a freeze for a couple of weeks there. But then as companies started to re-platform their entire customer service centers, they had this challenge about how do they engage with their customers and how do they allow their customers to engage with them. And that was a huge driver in sort of adopting some of this technology. One of the key areas, and Robert from TD Bank spoke about it, is the use of going to call centers. Call avoidance and contact center avoidance or deflection and automation is becoming one of the biggest areas during the pandemic because customer service centers can't operate in the way that they should. Many of them had to go through replatforming, and so the chatbot filled a void there in terms of being able to engage with customers. And as we see, the experiences are getting better and better all the time. So, so I want to talk about a couple of trends sort of emerging in conversational AI, and then look at the multi-bot sort of approach to it. Three big trends we see. One is creating more engaging experiences. So as conversation moves beyond simple request response, question and answer, and you heard that in our previous two speakers about how they're integrating it with some of their banking systems, solving real problems for customers. So creating engaging experiences is one. Expanding use cases is another. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The range in which you could apply this technology is actually quite immense. We ourselves in ServiceBot think about this across the entire customer lifecycle, not just sort of inbound support, but we think about it as on the customer acquisition phase, the operations phase, the retention phase, the renewal, the loyalty. We see opportunities right across the board for that. And one of the trends that the speakers mentioned is that voice is becoming increasingly important, applying this technology in the voice in the IVR space. And then finally, one of the other trends we see is some of these bots are getting very, very big. We heard from NatWest talking about their bot being deployed right across the UK in very, very high volumes. We see that in the US as well, where I'm based. We see some very big bots in the telco and banking mainly are the two spaces. They bring their own sort of challenges with them. Just about ServiceBot, we work with many brands in banking, insurance, and finance, helping them introduce maybe their first bot, but also as they become more mature, how to grow from there. So let's talk about sort of some of the engaging experiences. So with the breakdown sort of centralized customer support, the people began to look at solving more operational things. And that's one of the big changes. Is it wasn't enough to just say, what are your opening hours? It was, I need to transfer, I need to cancel something, I need to buy something. So we saw a lot of, changes, modifications, cancellations, a lot of those requests coming in because of the pandemic, as people weren't able to sort of operate normally. Offices got shut down, which meant that if you needed to send something in or if you needed to engage with a human, you were calling up, couldn't get through, then you'd use sort of the chatbot to do it. So we're seeing more engaging experiences. We're seeing the emergence of what we call multi-part queries, which are the complex ones, which is when somebody types in, I need to pay a bill because my credit card just got blocked, right? So that's two different statements in once, and AI is getting better at handling that, but you have to build that into your conversation. We're seeing stories being woven in. So you heard Robert talk about that in the TD Bank, where creating groups of these intents, grouping intents into stories and journeys is becoming more important, and conversational design is becoming very, very important. And we see these trends in companies like Google Dialogflow have introduced a higher level customer experience to start to talk about stories. We see RASA, which is the open source NLP platform, talk about stories. So stories are becoming more important. Not just can I, the question and answer, can I respond to something, but how do I make that more like a real conversation? And that's the other big trend we're seeing in certain industries, particularly in healthcare, is they're looking for more human-like conversation. Everybody's trying to emulate this human-like sort of conversation. The pandemic really pushed forward telehealth, right? And the ability of doctors and nurses to provide patient care remotely. So we're seeing that sort of grow, is that more human-like conversations, bringing in things like avatars, are becoming important to try. People have recognized that services can be delivered remotely, and who knows when the next sort of when this pandemic is going to end. So people are really embracing this technology to try and deliver better experiences and solve sort of problems, right? Sentiment obviously is almost standard now, monitoring sentiment. And well, we like to talk about automation first, not automation only with this technology. But a good example of sentiment would be routing the call or the request coming in maybe to a human based upon sentiment. So you don't try and resolve it with a bot if you have a really, really negative sentiment and there's a real problem. So sentiment becoming really important in some of those engagements. Secondly, we're seeing the expanding number of use cases, more and more, the growth in how this technology has been applied and where, right? So we have, for some of our customers, we've used cases around digital onboarding, right? So we can send the bots out to customers to actually collect information. One of the big things we saw from certainly the insurance companies and the banks, because the offices were locked down, you weren't able to send in documents. So KYC documents, or in the insurance, proof of no claims bonus, right? These documents were normally sent into a shared services center, but all these shared services centers are now closed. So how do you do that? And so we created use cases for sending out the bot to a human to their phone. The bot pops up on their phone and says, hey, I'm here to help you onboard. I need to collect some documents from you. Can you take out your phone? Can you take a picture of your driver's license now with your phone? And we take that document then and upload it. We're seeing tech support. We're seeing quotation assistance. So we have a use case around online conversion. We're seeing, as I said, banks are looking at the whole KYC and AML, using this proactively to go out and not just wait. So proactively as well as sort of reactively, call deflection, IVR, we're just seeing the number of use cases explode here as to where this technology can be used. And again, the key to this is, I think one of the speakers mentioned, is that you want to create a consistent experience across different channels. You want to make sure it's the same bot providing that same experience across the different channels, right, for your customers. And then finally, we're seeing the emergence of really large scale projects. Many companies test their first conversational AI experience with one group of users. And when they iron out maybe the quirks and when they sort of get it going, they're now saying, well, we can now grow this out. We can expose it to all our customer segments. We can expose it to different languages. And we're seeing that happen. Gartner talks about two main use cases for conversational AI. One is to engage your customers, and the other is to engage your employees. If you're a multinational and pharmaceutical company and you want to engage your employees, you're doing that in several languages. And again, employee engagement was one of the big things that came out of the recent crisis, because companies needed to touch base with their employees. You no longer had them coming into offices. So that became very, very important. So scaling and resilience and making sure things stayed up and worked. I'm not sure if you guys in Europe were aware, but Amazon, the big outage in November, took down an entire availability zone. Becoming important now if your stuff is in the cloud, to make sure you have that failback and resilience, as this is becoming a core part of business. Right. So there's some of the trends. So what's actually happening? What's with these trends? What's actually happening is the complexity is increasing. we're seeing a much more increasing complexity. We're seeing, particularly in the monolithic bot sort of world, as you sort of build in sort of more and more intents. We heard one of the speakers talk about 120 intents, I think, in the NatWest bot. Other talk about limitation intents. As you build and add more intents, it gets more complex. And the training of this AI becomes more complex as you do this, right? And as the complexity increases, very often the customer experience can suffer. We know of one very large telco here in the US who have a significant number, one of the largest in the world. They automated about 10% of their inbound traffic. So they're doing about 1 million calls per month in automation using conversational AI. They stopped at the 10%. And the reason they stopped is that their NPS scores started to suffer. And so they said, we cannot go further until we solve the customer experience problem, right? Now, as these things get bigger and more complex, the problem then is, how do you train them and how do you manage them? And how do you add more features and more intents without breaking the ones we have? And that's a big, big problem. This is a picture of actually what the AI sees. This is a picture of an actual conversational experience that we captured using one of our tools. And what you're seeing is how the computer sees each utterance from a customer and the intent. The outside is actually the outliers. That's where the AI couldn't solve it. It's the outliers. The inside is actually where the intents that it can solve. And as you can see, it's a big blob. It's very hard to see connections between different intents and how people are using them and where they go in their journeys. So this is what happens when you build sort of large monolithic platforms and try and stuff more into them. We know another major US bank where it's a very high profile sort of chatbot, but the small and medium-sized business part of the business, they couldn't get any capacity. It's 2 years before they'll even get any capacity to add more intents in. So this is the problem with building things in a monolithic scale. We've got an alternative approach. It's called the multi-bot architecture. And it's very similar to what Robert suggested in the Conversation Manager. It's the idea that you can have a manager or a dispatcher basically manage the conversation and route the request down to the individual skills-based bots, okay? So this is what we're going to sort of talk about today and the advantages of this kind of architecture, right? This isn't new, right? Think about it, what we're doing. Most of the stuff the chatbot's doing is replacing customer service. We do this today and have done it for years using IVRs, right? We've routed based on subject matter or skills. And as an organization, think of companies themselves, they've had receptionists welcoming people coming in the door and then, you know, guiding them to sales or service or a person or a team or whatever. So this idea of routing based on skills and this idea of organizational hierarchies based around skills and teams is not new, right? So we're doing it today. That's what's doing. That's why we think it's a good model. So that's sort of on the service side. We're doing that today. If you look now at applications and software sort of technology, it is also changed from, you know, one big monolith into, in the technical sense, it's what they call microservices architecture. But it's basically breaking the problem down into smaller pieces. And what this allows them to do, it allows them to grow easily. It allows them to add more functionality quicker. It allows them to not break things when they do add new things. It becomes cheaper and faster to maintain technology when you build it in this light. Okay, so if you think about it, we're doing it in contact centers, we're doing it in software. We think we should be doing it in the conversational AI space, right? And we call this multi-bot orchestration, right? And it's simply the concept that we want to find, if we find all these use cases to help our customers, whether it's in the customer onboarding, we have use cases around, for example, applications, filling out applications. And I heard somebody mention application as well. So if your customer gets to the end of filling out an application for a loan or a mortgage or a credit card, there's a good chance you can convert them. If they don't fill out the application, you can't convert them. So we see lots of cases around helping customers onboard, acquire them, help them, get that quote, operations, claims, support, retention. These are all of the various use cases that we see. And if you think about it now, we allow our teams of people with the skills to build these bots. So we allow the acquisition team to build a bot around onboarding or around applications or around sort of quotations. We allow the operations people to build a bot around billing or claims or scheduling or running, the account, right? Support people. So we break the problem up, not just from a technology perspective, but from an ownership perspective as to who's the best people to create the content to manage these bots. And so we devolve it into sort of a team effort, make it easy for these teams to build these bots. And then we use the technology to worry about how do we bring that back to a single conversation, and how do we do things like disambiguation. So let me give you an example. In an insurance company, if you talk about an intent around a claim, I need to lodge a claim. You might have three different policies. You might have home policy, car policy, life policy. Which claim is it? And so disambiguation is if there's more than one answer, it's going back to the customer saying, is this for claims or for life or whatever, right? If you've multiple bank accounts, it's disambiguating which bank account you want that statement for. So what we do is we allow the virtual assistant or the digital assistant in the middle to actually solve those problems so that the individual bots don't have to worry about it. We'll solve that using the technology. So how does it work? Well, as I said, we have these individual skills-based bots. These can be standalone. They can also be built on different NLP engines. So we've heard which is the best engine. There are different engines that have different advantages and capabilities. For example, Lex only handles English really well, whereas Dialogflow will handle multiple languages. We had to use Watson in the Middle East because it was the only one we could find that handled Arabic until Wit.ai came along. So we actually believe that you can use these NLP engines to solve the problem, use the right engine to solve the right problem. And so independence of the underlying NLP we think is important, right? But basically building up these skills individually as standalone bots, and then using this dispatcher, which has its own sort of NLP, using it to understand what the customer is asking for, the context of what the question was, and then dispatching it down to the skills-based bot down here to actually resolve. And what happens if this bot can't answer it? The question comes back up to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher says, okay, well, that wasn't a balance inquiry question. So maybe it was a fraud sort of inquiry. So the dispatcher knows then, in terms of confidence scores, which other bots can also solve similar type questions. And this is where we get into things like intent overlap. We get into intent mapping and distance between intents. So we can understand, is it better to split off intents into multiple bots so that we can solve the customer's problem easier. How these bots get understood, Gartner calls it patterns of discovery. So how the dispatcher understands what these bots are capable of doing. There's multiple patterns of discovery, how you can do it. The bots can register, or the virtual assistant can send it out to multiple bots at the same time and see which one comes back and use confidence scores to do it. There's a variety of patterns here in which to do it. Now, once we have the dispatcher on top, then we have the opportunity to put what we call pipelines on top of that. So pipelines now give us a way of managing and sharing things. They give us a way of, for example, on an inbound pipeline, detecting data that should not be in the conversation and taking it out. So PII information. Hi, my name is Carl. My credit card number is 1234567. It's broken. It doesn't work. Okay. Identifying that data and saying, we don't need that data to be able to take the next step. Automatically redacting data from a conversation before it goes into the system, before it goes right through, is a great way of doing it. So inbound pipelines gives you an ability to control. Personalization is another good example of inbound sort of pipeline, where we see one of the other speakers said customers want a more personalized experience. So rather than the chatbot just saying, hi, how can I help? It's, hello, Mr. McLoyne. I see you paid your bill recently. Thank you very much for that. I see your credit card's up for renewal soon. Is this what you're calling about? So predicting the question and being able to be proactive about how to help them. So these are inbound pipelines. Outbound pipelines do things like prevent oversharing of information, making sure that some developer doesn't suddenly publish the entire packet of information. But they're also used for, fallback is used for, well, what happens if the intents don't understand? And this is where we link into knowledge systems and knowledge management and search systems to be able to try and resolve that query. One of the things that we had to do in building this architecture is teach bots to give up. That's kind of an interesting concept because AI tends to be what we call greedy. It tends to want to keep and try and answer it, even if the confidence level is very, very low. And so we've had to teach these bots underneath to give up so that we can actually allow the dispatcher to actually assign it to another bot or to use the fallback pipeline to take an alternative, right? So these are ways in which we do it. We can centralize things like human handover here at this point, centralize authentication and security, which means that the builders of these individual skills-based bots don't have to worry about authentication, security. That can be handled up here, allow them to worry about the content, the subject matter, and solving sort of the customer's problems, right? So these are the benefits of multi-bot architecture. Faster to build, so it's up to 70% faster to build and train these things, particularly if you don't have to worry about, well, what happens if I break something? What happens if I add another intent in here? Does something break elsewhere, right? They're easier and cheaper to support and maintain once they are developed. As I said, low risk of breaking something. We can push out the management of these solutions to the subject matter experts. We see a lower reliance on expert teams. We now are using the technology to solve things like intents and overlaps and training, and we allow the subject matter experts to do their job. So we don't need as many of the high-powered AI teams because we've broken the problem up, and so we're not dealing with hundreds and thousands of intents in a single model. It becomes much easier to build and maintain, and we're seeing much higher NPS scores from being able to do this because of that. But the big ones are scaling. This thing scales horizontally, so you can build something that's easily scalable without actually going back to that sort of monolithic architecture. And then finally, just on the use case, this is just one of our customers in the UK, World Remit. They then, same thing, they got slammed during COVID. They almost immediately, they had to put their contact center at home. Almost immediately, they got bombarded with calls because everybody's now trying to help out their families at home. So they got slammed. So what we did is we deployed, within the first 2 weeks, we deployed the first bot. And then because we iterate on it using this sort of microservice and multi-bot approach, add in functionality very easily and quickly. Within a month, we had achieved about a 60% containment rate. I heard NatWest talk about 40% containment. So I guarantee we'll be able to get you up to 60% if you want. So we're dealing with high volume things here. But we're doing it in a way that allows them to add functionality easily and quickly, which is really what we want to do here. Build for scale, but it shouldn't cost the world in terms of being able to support and maintain these solutions, right? And I think that's sort of the key message sort of going away. So net, we think it's the right architecture. I was delighted to hear Robert from TD talk about Conversation Manager and this idea of putting bots with domain expertise, solving different problems together, and then figuring out how to get that request in. Because let's be honest, that's what we do today in our organizations. It's how we build our enterprises, and it's how we build our customer service. So with that, I will take any questions.